Once upon a time, in a bustling suburban neighborhood, much like yours, lived a young man named Marcus Chen. At 28, Marcus had everything going for him. A successful career as a software developer, a beautiful fiancée named Sarah, and a close-knit family that most people would envy. Well, almost close-knit. You see, Marcus hadn't spoken to his younger brother David in 3 years. Not since the incident, as their mother painfully referred to it at every family gathering. It had started with David's struggle with addiction, which led him to steal Marcus's life savings, money that was meant for Marcus and Sarah's dream house. $65,000, gone in a single betrayal. Marcus remembered that day like it was yesterday. He had walked into his apartment to find his safe empty, with only a hastily scribbled note from David. "I'm sorry, I'll pay you back someday." The words had burned themselves into Marcus's memory, along with the image of his brother's desperate face the last time he saw him. Their mother, Grace, never gave up trying to bridge the gap between her sons. Every Sunday after church, she would invite both to dinner, knowing full well that Marcus would ask, "Is he coming?" and decline if the answer was yes. Sarah, too, had tried to convince Marcus that life was too short for such bitterness, but Marcus would simply reply, "You don't understand what it's like to be betrayed by your own blood." The neighborhood where Marcus lived was home to an elderly gentleman named Mr. Rodriguez, who had a peculiar habit of sitting on his porch every evening, watching the world go by while sipping chamomile tea. Marcus would often see him during his evening runs, and they'd exchange pleasant nods. One particularly humid evening, Mr. Rodriguez called out to him, "Young man, would you like some tea? You look like you could use a break." Perhaps it was the unusual heat, or maybe the weight of his thoughts, but Marcus found himself accepting the invitation. As they sat there, the old man shared his own story, one of betrayal by his business partner of 30 years, who had left him bankrupt and homeless in his 60s. "And you know what the funny thing is?" Mr. Rodriguez chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Every year on Christmas, I send him a card thanking him." Marcus nearly choked on his tea. Thanking him? For what? For teaching me that forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's about freeing yourself. You see, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I spent 2 years being angry, lost my health, my joy, even my faith. Then one day I realized something. My unforgiveness was costing me more than he ever took. The words hit Marcus like a splash of cold water. That night, he couldn't sleep, thinking about how much energy he spent maintaining his anger at David. He thought about all the family gatherings he'd missed, the strain it put on his relationship with Sarah, and how his mother's voice always cracked when she mentioned David's name. The next morning, Marcus did something unexpected. He called in sick to work and drove to the rehabilitation center where he knew David was working as a counselor. Yes, David had gotten clean, turned his life around, and was helping others do the same. Marcus knew this from his mother's updates, though he'd always pretended not to care. When Marcus walked into the center, David was leading a group session. Through the window, Marcus could see his brother, clean-cut, healthy, and speaking with passion to a room full of people, hanging on his every word. The sight made Marcus's heart ache with a mixture of pride and regret. David froze mid-sentence when he saw Marcus. The room fell silent. Then, to everyone's surprise, Marcus started laughing, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that brought tears to his eyes. "You look good, little brother," he managed to say. David's eyes welled up with tears. "Marcus, I've been saving every penny. I've got about 40,000 saved up and Marcus cut him off with a hug. "Keep it," he whispered. "Use it to help more people get clean. That's worth more than any dream house." The reunion wasn't smooth sailing. There were tough conversations, tears, and moments of uncomfortable silence. But as they sat in a nearby diner, sharing a plate of fries like they used to as kids, Marcus felt lighter than he had in years. That Sunday, when Grace opened her door to find both her sons standing there for family dinner, she didn't even try to hold back her tears. Sarah, who had coincidentally dropped by, couldn't stop grinning. Mr. Rodriguez, watching from his porch across the street, raised his teacup in a knowing salute. This story reflects the transformative power of forgiveness that lies at the heart of Christian faith. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he included these profound words: "Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors." The connection between receiving God's forgiveness and extending forgiveness to others is not coincidental. It's fundamental to our spiritual journey. Consider the parable Jesus told about the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18, verse 21 to 35. When Peter asked how many times he should forgive someone who sins against him, Jesus responded with a story about a servant who was forgiven an impossible debt by his master, only to turn around and refuse to forgive a much smaller debt owed to him by a fellow servant. The message is clear. Having been forgiven an unpayable debt by God, how can we withhold forgiveness from others? In Marcus's story, we see echoes of the prodigal son, but with a twist. It's the wronged brother who must make the journey home, not physically but spiritually, by choosing to forgive. Like the father in Jesus' parable, who ran to embrace his wayward son, Marcus ultimately chose to meet his brother with grace rather than judgment. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians 4:32, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you." This is not a suggestion but a command, rooted in our own experience of divine forgiveness. When Mr. Rodriguez spoke about forgiveness freeing the forgiver, he was expressing a profound spiritual truth. Unforgiveness is a prison we build for ourselves. Consider Joseph's words to his brothers who had sold him into slavery. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." David's theft, though intended for harm, led him to rehabilitation and a position where he could help others find healing. Through forgiveness, what the enemy meant for evil, God transformed into a testimony of his grace. Colossians 3 verse 13 reminds us to bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. The standard is high. We are to forgive as completely and unconditionally as Christ forgave us. This doesn't mean forgetting or pretending the wrong never happened, but it means choosing to release the debt, just as Marcus did with the money David owed him. Dear friends, perhaps you're carrying a burden of unforgiveness right now. Maybe, like Marcus, you've been deeply wounded by someone you trusted. The hurt is real, and the debt may be significant. But I encourage you to consider, what is that unforgiveness costing you? What family dinners are you missing? What relationships are strained? What joy is being stolen? Remember, forgiveness is not about deserving. None of us deserved God's forgiveness, yet He freely gave it. It's not about forgetting. Marcus and David will always remember what happened, but they chose not to let it define their future. And it's not about feeling ready. Forgiveness is a choice we make, often before our emotions catch up. Take a moment today to reflect on who you might need to forgive. Like Marcus's simple walk into the rehabilitation center, your journey of forgiveness might begin with a single step. The freedom you find might not just change your heart, it might change someone else's life too. After all, in the words of Mr. Rodriguez, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Choose freedom, choose healing, choose forgiveness. Your heart will thank you for it.